It was 6:30 in the morning, and the English Channel was the color of wet slate. Thousands of young men crouched inside flat-bottomed steel boxes, riding waves that made some of them sick before they ever saw land. The boats were called LCVPs, landing craft built to carry soldiers from ship to shore in a single run, then drop a steel ramp and let them out into whatever was waiting. Most of them had been awake for hours already. Many had been at sea for 2 days before that, crammed below deck on troop transports, eating cold rations and trying not to think too hard about what was coming. Seasickness alone took a toll before a single shot was fired. Ahead of them sat 4 miles of curved beach in Normandy, France. The Allies called it Omaha. It would become the bloodiest stretch of coastline on D-Day. Hour, the official moment the first wave was scheduled to land, had been set with careful precision back in England. Planners had studied tide charts, moon phases, and beach gradients for months. On paper, it looked almost manageable. Why? Because almost everything that could go wrong did. The historian Stephen Ambrose, who interviewed hundreds of D-Day veterans for his book D-Day, June 6, 1944, described Omaha as the place where the invasion plan met reality and reality won. The plan called for naval guns and bombers to destroy the German defenses before the first soldier ever touched the sand. Low clouds and rough seas threw that plan off by hundreds of yards. Most of the bombs fell harmlessly inland, cratering empty farmland. The bluffs above the beach, steep grass-covered cliffs rising nearly 100 feet, were left almost untouched. Behind those bluffs waited what the Germans called Widerstandsnester, a word that simply means resistance nests. Small fortified positions packed with machine guns, mortars, and artillery aimed down at the open sand below. In plain terms, they were bunkers built specifically to look down on every square foot of beach a soldier might cross. There was nowhere to hide. Just sand, water, and men. To make matters worse, dozens of specially built DD tanks, amphibious tanks fitted with floating screens meant to swim ashore ahead of the infantry, sank in the rough seas before they ever reached the beach. The men who were supposed to have armored cover landed with none. One of the men who lived through that morning was 19-year-old Private Harold Baumgarten, a soldier with the 116th Infantry Regiment. He left behind one of the most detailed first-hand accounts historians still reference today. He remembered the landing ramps dropping too far from shore, forcing men into water well over their heads. He remembered the weight of a soaked pack pulling at his shoulders as he tried to wade forward. He remembered a noise that did not sound like gunfire so much as a hailstorm made of metal, striking the water all around him. Many men never made it past the surf at all. Baumgarten later wrote his own memoir of that morning, titled Eyewitness on Omaha Beach, one of the few first-hand accounts detailed enough that historians still cross-reference it against military records today. He described how the obstacles the Germans had planted in the sand, jagged steel barriers and wooden stakes designed to tear open the bottoms of landing craft, forced many boats to stop short and unload their men into deep water instead of onto dry sand. That single design choice, a few hundred extra yards of open water between the boats and the beach, may have cost more lives that morning than almost any other factor. This is the part most retellings rush past. Not the geography, the waiting. Because for the soldiers pinned behind the only cover on that beach, a stalled tank, a low stone seawall, a tangle of rusted barbed wire, the worst part was rarely the noise itself. It was the seconds in between, the seconds where a man had to decide whether to stay still or move, knowing either choice might be the wrong one. So here is what actually happened that morning. Entire companies lost their officers within the first few minutes. Radios were destroyed or ruined by seawater. The original invasion plan called for units to land in tight formation and move quickly toward marked exits called draws, narrow gaps cut into the bluffs over centuries by small streams. Almost none of that happened the way it was drawn up on a map back in England. One of the hardest hit units that morning was Company A of the 116th Infantry, made up largely of young men from the small town of Bedford, Virginia. 19 of them died within minutes of one another, the largest proportional loss suffered by any American community on a single day of the entire war. The historian Alex Kershaw documented their story in his book The Bedford Boys, tracing how one small town lost almost an entire generation of its sons in the space of a single morning on a single beach. Why tell that story instead of a general's? Because the men who eventually broke the standstill on Omaha were no longer following anyone's master plan. There was no master plan left to follow. By mid-morning, the situation looked bad enough that General Omar Bradley, watching reports come in from offshore, seriously considered diverting the remaining landing forces away from Omaha entirely and abandoning the beach. For a few hours, the entire invasion plan on that stretch of coast hung by a thread. Some of the messages reaching the ships offshore were so grim that planners genuinely debated whether to cut their losses and send the next wave somewhere else. What actually turned it were small, leaderless groups of survivors, cut off from their units who began moving on their own. Junior officers and ordinary privates started making decisions no training manual had ever prepared them for. There was no single order that triggered this. It happened in dozens of places along the beach almost simultaneously, as if the same idea had occurred to many frightened, exhausted men at once. Captain Joe Dawson, a company commander with the 1st Infantry Division, gathered a handful of soldiers and pushed through one of the few weak points in the German defenses near the village of Colleville-sur-Mer. They climbed, not because headquarters had ordered it, but because staying on the beach meant almost certain death. This is the counterintuitive twist historians keep returning to. Omaha Beach was not won by following the invasion plan. It was won by abandoning it. It was the decision of unnamed corporals and sergeants, men whose names rarely appear in any film, to gather 2 or 3 soldiers around them and simply move forward. That slowly turned the tide on that beach. By early afternoon, small pockets of Americans had reached the high ground above the sand. German resistance along sections of the bluffs began to weaken, not because it had been destroyed outright, but because it had been bypassed, flanked, and worn down by men who refused to stay pinned where they were. What does it feel like to make a decision like that, with no orders, no certainty, and the men beside you falling? Most of the soldiers who survived Omaha rarely spoke about that morning afterward. Many carried it quietly for the rest of their lives, in the way people carry things they cannot fully put into words. Today, the bluffs above that beach are quiet. The Normandy American Cemetery now sits on the very high ground those soldiers fought to reach, overlooking the same stretch of sand. Thousands of white marble crosses and stars of David stand in careful rows, facing west, toward home. The French government maintains the grounds to this day, a quiet form of gratitude passed down through generations who never met the men buried there. Every June, the town of Bedford, Virginia still remembers its 19 sons through the National D-Day Memorial, built in that town for one simple reason. No other American community lost so much, so suddenly, on a single morning of the war. Descendants of those families still gather there each year, on the same date, at roughly the same hour those young men once waded ashore. Visitors walking the beach today can still find remnants of old German bunkers, half buried in the grass, looking out over sand that now fills with families and tourists instead of landing craft. Children build sandcastles in the shadow of structures once built to kill their great-grandfather's generation. The lesson those bluffs still teach has very little to do with tactics, and almost everything to do with people. It is a lesson about what ordinary men do when the plan disappears, and only the choice directly in front of them remains. It was 6:30 in the morning, and the English Channel was the color of wet slate. For thousands of young men, that small, ordinary detail, the color of the water, would become one of the last things they remembered about peace, before history asked everything of them, and an entire generation of unnamed soldiers decided, one small choice at a time, how that single day would end.